The penthouse stretched across the entire 72nd floor, a monument to wealth that pierced the Manhattan skyline like a crystal spear. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around every wall, offering a god's view of the city below, where millions of lives unfolded in blissful ignorance of the man who watched them from above. Marcus Ashford stood at one of those windows now, a glass of 30-year-old scotch hanging loosely in his hand, observing the tiny cars that crawled through the streets like ants following invisible trails. He was 43 years old, worth approximately $700 million, and at this precise moment he could not remember the last time someone had touched him with genuine affection. The apartment itself was a masterpiece of modern architecture and interior design. Italian marble floors reflected the soft glow of custom lighting fixtures that had been commissioned from an artist in Copenhagen. The furniture was all original pieces, some from the mid-century modern period, others contemporary sculptures that happened to be functional. A Rothko hung in the living room, a Basquiat in the dining area, and a small Picasso sketch in the hallway leading to the master suite. Each piece had been acquired at auction, each purchase meticulously documented by his wealth management team, each artwork appraised and insured for sums that could feed a small town for a year. Marcus had stopped seeing them as art long ago. They were investments now, assets on a balance sheet, things that existed in his space but not in his consciousness. The silence in the apartment was profound, broken only by the whisper of the climate control system and the occasional distant sound of the city that managed to penetrate the triple-paned windows. Marcus employed a housekeeper who came 3 times a week, always during the hours when he was at the office, so that he never had to interact with her. He employed a private chef who prepared meals that were delivered in heated containers, arranged beautifully on his table by invisible hands. He employed a personal assistant who managed his calendar, his correspondence, his dry cleaning, and his life, all from an office 3 blocks away. He had created a perfectly efficient system that allowed him to exist in complete isolation while maintaining the appearance of a full, successful life. His phone sat on the glass coffee table, silent. It was always silent these days, except for the notifications that mattered for business. There were no text messages from friends asking how he was doing, no missed calls from family members checking in, no random invitations to dinner parties or weekend getaways. He had systematically eliminated all of those connections over the past decade, each relationship abandoned as he climbed higher up the mountain of success. At first, it had been unintentional, a natural consequence of working 16-hour days and building his hedge fund from nothing into one of the most successful investment firms on Wall Street. Then it had become deliberate, a conscious choice to cut away anything that felt like an obligation, anything that demanded his emotional energy, anything that reminded him he was human and not just a profit-generating machine. Marcus had grown up in a middle-class suburb of Chicago, the son of a high school teacher and a nurse. His childhood had been unremarkable in its normalcy, filled with little league games, family dinners around a worn kitchen table, and summers spent riding bikes with neighborhood kids until the streetlights came on. He had been good at math, exceptional actually, with a mind that could see patterns in numbers the way some people could see stories in clouds. That gift had earned him a scholarship to MIT, then a position at Goldman Sachs, then the confidence to strike out on his own. The money came quickly once he started his own fund, almost frighteningly so, and with it came the trappings that were expected of someone with his net worth: the penthouse, the cars, the vacation homes in Aspen and the Hamptons, the watches that cost more than his parents' first house. But somewhere in that ascent, he had lost something essential. He could not pinpoint the exact moment, could not identify the specific decision that had sealed him off from the world. It had been gradual, like a door slowly closing, the gap between him and everyone else narrowing with each passing year, until one day he realized he was completely alone on his side. His parents had died within 2 years of each other, his mother from cancer and his father from what the doctors called a heart attack, but Marcus knew was a broken heart. He had attended both funerals, standing at the back in his expensive suit, accepting condolences from relatives he barely recognized, and then returning to New York on his private jet before the receptions had ended. He had one sister, Karen, who lived in Oregon with her husband and 3 children. They spoke perhaps twice a year, awkward phone calls where she updated him on the kids' activities, and he made vague promises to visit that they both knew he would never keep. Romance had been equally disposable. There had been relationships over the years, beautiful women attracted to his wealth and status, none of them lasting more than a few months. He would meet them at charity galas or through mutual acquaintances, would enjoy the physical companionship and the arm candy they provided at events, and then would grow bored or irritated when they began to expect more from him than expensive dinners and luxury vacations. The last one was 2 years ago, a model named Svetlana who had accused him of being emotionally unavailable before storming out of his life. He had not disagreed with her assessment. In fact, he had felt a sense of relief when she left, as if a burden had been lifted. That relief terrified him, the realization that he preferred solitude to intimacy, that he had become someone who found human connection exhausting rather than fulfilling. The scotch in his glass was almost gone. Marcus moved away from the window and walked to the bar, a custom piece of furniture made from reclaimed wood and brass that had cost $40,000. He poured another measure, neat, and carried it to the white leather sofa that faced a television he never watched. The remote control sat on the side table, a piece of technology he had not touched in months. What was the point? Television was designed for mass consumption, stories crafted to appeal to the common denominator, and he had long ago convinced himself that he was beyond such pedestrian entertainment. Books lined one wall of his study, first editions and rare volumes that he had purchased because they were supposed to be important, but he could not remember the last time he had opened one for pleasure rather than professional development. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if Marcus had allowed himself to notice. Instead, he thought about the portfolio he needed to review before the markets opened in Tokyo, the conference call he had scheduled tomorrow morning with investors in Singapore, the quarterly earnings reports that would determine whether he moved 50 million here or 100 million there. Numbers had become his entire world, the only language he spoke fluently, the only thing that made sense in a universe that otherwise seemed chaotic and meaningless. His reflection stared back at him from the darkening window, a man in expensive casual clothes who looked younger than his years thanks to a personal trainer and a carefully monitored diet. His hair was still thick and dark, his jawline sharp, his body lean and strong. Women still looked at him with interest when he attended the rare social function. Men still sought his attention, his advice, his approval. On paper, he was everything American culture told him he should want to be: successful, wealthy, powerful, independent. In reality, he was a ghost haunting his own life, going through the motions that no longer held any meaning. The loneliness had been a dull ache for years, something he could ignore with work and routine and the various distractions that money could buy. But lately it had become sharper, more insistent, a physical sensation that settled in his chest and refused to leave. He would wake at 3 in the morning, his heart racing for no reason, and lie in his king-sized bed staring at the ceiling while his mind raced through every decision that had brought him to this moment. He would sit in meetings with other wealthy men, discussing strategies and opportunities, and feel like he was watching himself from outside his body, performing a role in a play he had not auditioned for. He would come home to this magnificent apartment and feel the walls pressing in on him despite the 10,000 square feet of luxury that surrounded him.
The trigger came on a Tuesday morning in March. Marcus was reviewing his schedule for the day when he received an email notification from his private banking team. It was his birthday. He was 43 years old. Not a single person had remembered. There were no cards waiting in his mailbox, no flowers delivered to his office, no calls or messages from anyone who mattered. His assistant had scheduled a meeting at the exact time he had been born 43 years ago, completely unaware of the significance. His sister had not reached out. His handful of business associates who knew the date had clearly deemed it unworthy of acknowledgement. The world had continued spinning without pausing to mark another year of his existence, and the realization hit him with unexpected force. He sat at his desk, the email still open on his screen, and felt something crack inside him. It was not grief exactly, not sadness in the conventional sense. It was more like a sudden clarity, a moment where all the lies he had been telling himself dissolved and left him staring at the raw truth of his life. He was rich beyond measure and utterly alone. He had everything money could buy and nothing that mattered. He had built an empire and imprisoned himself inside it. The crack widened, and before he could stop it, tears were streaming down his face, the first he had shed since his father's funeral 8 years earlier. Marcus canceled his meetings for the day, claiming illness, and spent the afternoon walking through Central Park. It was something he had not done in years, this aimless wandering through public space where ordinary people gathered to live their ordinary lives. He watched joggers and dog walkers, saw nannies pushing strollers and tourists taking selfies, observed elderly couples holding hands on benches, and teenagers skateboarding on paths they probably were not supposed to use. Everyone seemed connected to something, part of some larger fabric that he existed outside of. A father played catch with his young son on a patch of grass, the boy's laughter carrying across the park when he finally caught the ball. A group of friends had spread blankets for a picnic, their conversation and laughter creating a bubble of joy that Marcus could observe, but not enter. He sat on a bench for over an hour, watching life happen around him, feeling like an anthropologist studying a foreign culture. When he returned to his penthouse that evening, the silence felt different. Not peaceful, as he had always told himself, but oppressive. The luxury that surrounded him seemed to mock his isolation, each expensive object a reminder of the price he had paid for his success. He poured himself a drink and stood at the window again, his usual position, but this time the view did not provide its customary sense of superiority. Instead, he felt like he was looking down at a world he had abandoned, a planet he had launched himself away from in pursuit of some goal that now seemed hollow and pointless. The next morning, Marcus did something unprecedented. He called his assistant and told her to clear his calendar for the entire week. Then he called his sister. The phone rang 4 times before she answered, her voice surprised and slightly wary. They had not spoken in 7 months, not since a brief, awkward conversation at Christmas. He asked about her children, really asked, listening to the details about soccer games and school plays and teenage drama. He told her it was his birthday, that he had just turned 43, and admitted that he had spent it alone. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and when Karen finally spoke, her voice was gentle in a way that made his chest ache. She invited him to visit, not someday, not eventually, but that weekend. Her youngest daughter was performing in a school musical, and there would be a family dinner afterward, and Marcus was welcome if he wanted to come. He accepted before he could talk himself out of it, booking a first-class ticket to Portland, even as part of his brain screamed that this was a mistake, that he did not belong in that world anymore, that he would regret breaking his carefully constructed isolation. But another part of him, a part he had suppressed for years, wanted desperately to sit at a dinner table with people who shared his blood, to hear children's voices in a home, to remember what it felt like to be part of something larger than himself. The flight was unremarkable, but Marcus found himself paying attention to the other passengers in a way he normally did not. The businessman across the aisle was video chatting with his family, promising his young daughter he would be home to read her a bedtime story. The elderly woman next to him showed him photos of her grandchildren, completely unprompted, sharing her joy with a stranger because it was too big to contain. Even the flight attendants seemed to exist in a network of relationships, joking with each other during quiet moments, checking in on regular passengers they recognized. Marcus realized he couldn't remember the last time someone had been genuinely pleased to see him, not for what he could provide, but simply for who he was. His sister picked him up at the airport in a minivan that clearly had seen better days. There were juice boxes in the cup holders, homework papers scattered on the floor, a child's jacket wadded up in the back seat. It was chaos and disorder and completely different from the sterile perfection Marcus had cultivated in his own life. Karen hugged him at arrivals, a real hug that lasted longer than the brief formal embraces he was accustomed to. And then she pulled back. She was smiling, but her eyes were concerned. She looked older than he remembered, with lines around her eyes and gray threading through her hair, but there was a warmth to her face that he had forgotten existed in his family. The house was modest, a three-bedroom ranch in a neighborhood of similar homes. The lawn needed mowing and the paint on the front door was fading, but there were bikes in the driveway and a basketball hoop over the garage and a sign in the window welcoming visitors. Inside was controlled chaos. His nephew and niece were fighting over the television remote, his teenage niece was on her phone ignoring everyone, and his brother-in-law was trying to assemble what appeared to be a bookshelf while muttering about the incomprehensibility of the instructions. It was loud and messy and completely overwhelming, and Marcus felt something in his chest loosen just slightly. Dinner that night was at a crowded kitchen table that barely fit 6 people. The food was simple: pasta and salad and garlic bread, prepared by his sister while everyone else set the table and argued about who had to do dishes. There were no servants, no chef, no perfectly plated courses designed to impress. Instead, there was his nephew spilling his milk, and his niece complaining about the amount of vegetables on her plate, and his brother-in-law telling a long, rambling story about a student at his school that made everyone laugh. Marcus sat at one end of the table, mostly silent, watching this family function with a synchronicity born from years of practice. They asked him about his life, but not in the way business associates did, not probing for information they could use or connections they could exploit. His youngest niece wanted to know if he had a dog, seemed disappointed when he said no, then asked if he liked dogs, and seemed even more disappointed when he admitted he had never thought about it. His nephew asked if he played video games, showed him pictures on his phone of some game Marcus did not recognize, invited him to play online sometime. His teenage niece asked if he was lonely, with the brutal honesty that only teenagers possess, and the table went quiet. Karen started to scold her daughter, but Marcus held up his hand. Yes, he told the girl, he was very lonely. She nodded, like this made perfect sense, then told him he should get a dog. Everyone laughed, and the moment passed, but Marcus felt seen in a way he had not experienced in years. After dinner, they attended the school musical. It was a production of Annie, performed by middle schoolers with varying degrees of talent and enthusiasm. Marcus sat in the uncomfortable auditorium seat, surrounded by other families with their phones out to record their children's performances, and watched his youngest niece play one of the orphans. She forgot her lines once, stood frozen on stage for what felt like an eternity, then was gently prompted by another student and continued. The audience applauded warmly. She was not the star, not the most talented performer, but when she came out for the final bow, she was beaming with pride and joy, scanning the audience until she found her family. When she spotted Marcus sitting next to her parents, her smile grew even wider, and she waved directly at him. Something broke in Marcus at that moment, or perhaps something began to heal. He could not be sure, but watching this child, his niece who barely knew him, be genuinely happy that he had shown up to watch her perform in a small school play in a town most people had never heard of, he understood what he had been missing. It was not grand gestures or expensive gifts or impressive achievements. It was this: presence, connection, mattering to someone not for what you could provide, but simply because you existed in their life. That night, sleeping in his sister's guest room on a bed that was far less comfortable than his Italian designer mattress, Marcus slept better than he had in months. The house was not silent. He could hear his nephew moving around in the next room, could hear the furnace kicking on, could hear the ordinary sounds of a home where people lived actual lives. When he woke in the morning, there were already voices downstairs, the smell of coffee and toast, the sound of his brother-in-law reading the newspaper and commenting on articles to no one in particular. He came down in his borrowed pajamas. He had packed only his usual expensive loungewear, which his sister had deemed ridiculous, and replaced with a pair of her husband's old flannel pants and a t-shirt from a charity run, and found his family having breakfast together before everyone scattered to their Saturday activities. Marcus spent the weekend being ordinary. He went to his nephew's basketball game and cheered from the bleachers. He helped his brother-in-law finish assembling the bookshelf, an experience that tested both their patience and their relationship. He sat with his teenage niece while she studied for a history test, discovering that he could actually be helpful explaining economic factors in the Civil War.
He played with the family's dog, a mutt they had rescued from a shelter who seemed to have unlimited energy and affection. He existed in their space, and they made room for him, and no one seemed to expect anything from him except his presence. That night, on Sunday evening before his flight back to New York, Karen took him aside. They sat on her back porch, drinking coffee in the fading light, and she told him something he needed to hear. She said she had watched him over the past few days, had seen how he interacted with her family, had noticed how he seemed to relax more with each passing hour. She told him she barely recognized the person he had become over the past decade, that the brother she remembered had been kind and funny and present, but the man who visited occasionally was distant and cold and seemed to be playing a role. She asked him if all the money had been worth it, if standing alone at the top was really better than having people to share the climb with. Marcus could not answer her, not honestly. Part of him wanted to defend his choices, to explain the discipline and sacrifice required to build what he had built, to justify the isolation as necessary for success. But sitting on that porch, with his sister's hand on his arm and her eyes full of concern rather than judgment, he could not summon the arguments. Instead, he asked her a question that had been forming in his mind all weekend. How did you do it? How did you stay connected to people, maintain relationships, build a family, create a life that seemed rich in ways that had nothing to do with money? How did you avoid becoming what I became? Karen smiled, sad but understanding. She told him it was not complicated, just consistent. You showed up, even when it was inconvenient. You called, even when you were busy. You prioritized people over profits, relationships over achievements, love over luxury. You remembered that success was not about what you accumulated, but who walked beside you through life. You accepted that being vulnerable was not weakness, but strength, that needing people was not a flaw, but fundamental to being human. And most importantly, you forgave yourself when you fell short, when you missed calls or forgot birthdays or let work take precedence, and you tried again the next day to do better. The flight back to New York felt different from the one leaving. Marcus stared out the window as the plane climbed, watching his sister's city shrink below him, and felt the weight of his choices settling back onto his shoulders. He was returning to his penthouse, his empire, his perfectly curated isolation, but now he could see it clearly for what it was, a prison he had built for himself, cell by expensive cell, until he was completely cut off from everything that made life worth living. The question was whether he was willing to do anything about it, whether he had the courage to dismantle what he had spent years constructing, whether it was even possible to find his way back to connection after so long in isolation. The city lights below spread out like constellations, millions of people living their lives in the darkness below. Each light represented someone's home, someone's story, someone's network of relationships and connections. Marcus had spent years looking down on all of it from his tower, convinced that his separation made him superior. Now he wondered if it just made him sad. His phone was in his pocket, silent as always, no messages waiting, no calls missed. He thought about his niece waving to him from the stage, about his nephew inviting him to play video games online, about his sister's hand on his arm as she told him the truth he needed to hear. He thought about the dog that greeted him each morning with pure joy, about the family dinners where everyone talked over each other, about the mess and chaos and love that filled his sister's modest home. When the plane landed, Marcus made a decision. He did not know yet what it would look like, did not have a detailed plan or strategy, but sitting in the back of the car service taking him from the airport to his penthouse, he knew that something had to change. He could not continue living the way he had been, could not sustain this level of isolation, could not keep pretending that wealth was an adequate substitute for warmth. The loneliness had become unbearable, just as the title of his life story suggested, and now he had to decide whether he was brave enough to do something about it. The penthouse felt different when Marcus returned. The silence that had once seemed peaceful now felt suffocating. The luxury that had once been satisfying now seemed hollow. He stood at his floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the city, and instead of feeling superior to the masses below, he felt isolated from them.
He was standing in one of the most expensive apartments in Manhattan, surrounded by millions of dollars worth of art and furniture, and he had never felt poorer in his life. The next morning, Marcus did not go to his office. Instead, he walked to a coffee shop near his building, a place he had passed 1,000 times but never entered. It was crowded with people working on laptops, reading newspapers, meeting friends for morning catch-ups. He ordered a regular coffee, not the expensive espresso drinks his assistant usually picked up for him, and sat at a small table by the window. No one knew who he was. No one cared. He was just another person drinking coffee on a Monday morning, and the anonymity was both terrifying and liberating. He watched people come and go, observed their interactions with the baristas, listened to fragments of conversations about weekend plans and work problems and relationship drama. These were ordinary lives, lived in ordinary ways, but there was a richness to them that his extraordinary life lacked. The woman next to him was video chatting with her toddler, making silly faces that made the child squeal with laughter. The two men at the counter were clearly old friends, greeting each other with complicated handshakes and genuine smiles. Even the barista seemed to know many of the customers by name, remembering their usual orders, asking about their families, creating moments of connection in the simple transaction of serving coffee. Marcus pulled out his phone and did something he had not done in years. He scrolled through his contacts, looking at names he barely recognized, connections that had atrophied from neglect. There was Michael from business school, who had invited him to his wedding 5 years ago, an invitation Marcus declined with a generic excuse. There was Jennifer from his old firm, who used to make him laugh during long days, who he had cut off when he started his own fund because she represented a past he was trying to escape. There was David, who had been his roommate at MIT, who had sent him Christmas cards every year for a decade before finally giving up. These were people who had cared about him, who had tried to maintain connection, who he had systematically pushed away in pursuit of success. He started with his sister, a simple text. "Thank you for this weekend. I needed it more than you know." Her response came immediately. "Anytime. The door is always open. Call me tomorrow?" He promised he would, and meant it. Then he scrolled further, stopped on Michael's name, hesitated for a long moment before typing, "I know it's been years, and I was a terrible friend. I'd like to do better. Coffee sometime?" He hit send before he could change his mind, then put his phone face down on the table, his heart racing like he had just made some massive financial gamble. Over the next few weeks, Marcus began the slow, uncomfortable work of rebuilding connections. Some people did not respond to his outreach, and he could not blame them. Some were politely distant, wary of his sudden interest after years of absence, but some, surprisingly, were willing to give him another chance. Michael agreed to coffee, which turned into a long conversation, where Marcus admitted to being an asshole, and Michael admitted he had written him off as another casualty of Wall Street success. Jennifer met him for drinks, where she told him about her career and her family, and Marcus listened, really listened, instead of waiting for his turn to talk. David invited him to a charity poker game, a monthly event with their old MIT crew, and Marcus attended despite feeling completely out of place among men who still knew how to relax and laugh and enjoy each other's company. But reconnecting was harder than Marcus had anticipated. Years of isolation had calcified certain patterns, made certain behaviors default. He would catch himself checking his phone during conversations, would feel his attention drifting when people talked about their ordinary concerns, would struggle with the give and take that relationships required. He was used to being the center of attention when he chose to engage, used to having his opinions treated as valuable insights, used to people deferring to him because of his wealth and success. In these ordinary friendships, he was just Marcus, and he had forgotten how to be that person. The hardest part was vulnerability. Marcus had spent years building walls, protecting himself from anything that felt like weakness, maintaining control in every situation. Real connection required letting those walls down, admitting uncertainty, sharing struggles, asking for help. When Michael asked how he was really doing, Marcus's instinct was to give the polished answer, the successful millionaire response. But he forced himself to be honest, to admit that he was lonely, that he had built a life that looked perfect from the outside but felt empty from the inside, that he was trying to figure out how to be a better person but wasn't sure he remembered how. Michael didn't offer solutions or judgment. He just nodded and said, "That takes guts to admit. Welcome back to being human." Marcus also began making changes in his daily life. He started having dinner at actual restaurants instead of having meals delivered to his penthouse. He went to the gym at normal hours instead of having his personal trainer come to his building at 6 in the morning. He attended a wine tasting event, a gallery opening, a charity gala, where he actually talked to people instead of making brief appearances before retreating. Each interaction was awkward, each conversation stilted, but he kept trying. He was 43 years old and relearning how to be social, like a child learning to walk after being bedridden for years. One evening, walking home from dinner with some of Michael's friends, Marcus passed a dog park. He stopped and watched for a while, remembering his niece's insistence that he should get a dog. The animals ran and played while their owners chatted with each other. An instant community formed around the shared experience of pet ownership. On impulse, Marcus pulled out his phone and searched for animal shelters in Manhattan. The next Saturday, he found himself at a rescue organization in Brooklyn looking at dogs who needed homes. The volunteer asked what he was looking for, and Marcus realized he had no idea. He had never had a pet, never been responsible for another living thing, never committed to something that couldn't be managed by his assistant. He left without adopting, overwhelmed by the decision, but he couldn't stop thinking about one particular dog. She was a medium-sized mutt, maybe 5 years old, with one ear that flopped down and eyes that seemed to ask if he was someone she could trust. The volunteer had said she had been at the shelter for 3 months, that older dogs were harder to place, that she was gentle and quiet, and just needed someone to give her a chance. Marcus returned the following weekend, and the weekend after that, spending time with the dog, taking her for walks, slowly convincing himself that maybe he could do this. On his 4th visit, he signed the adoption papers, purchased supplies he had researched obsessively, and brought her home with a car service whose driver looked amused by the entire situation. The dog, whom he named Murphy after his favorite professor at MIT, changed his penthouse immediately. Suddenly, there was fur on the Italian marble. There were toys scattered on the floor. There were needs that had to be met regardless of his schedule. Murphy didn't care about his wealth or success. She cared about walks and meals and attention. She greeted him every evening with genuine joy, her entire body wiggling with excitement that he had returned. She slept at the foot of his bed, her presence a comfort against the silence, and she forced him into contact with other people in ways he had not anticipated. Walking Murphy meant encountering other dog owners, joining the informal community of the neighborhood dog park, making small talk with strangers who shared the common bond of pet ownership. The woman with the golden retriever asked him about Murphy's breed, shared stories about her own rescue experience, invited him to join a weekend walking group. The elderly man with the Chihuahua became a regular presence on their morning walks, teaching Marcus about the neighborhood history, introducing him to other locals. Even the barista seemed to know many of the customers by name, remembering their usual orders, asking about their families, creating moments of connection in the simple transaction of serving coffee. Marcus pulled out his phone and did something he had not done in years. He scrolled through his contacts, looking at names he barely recognized, connections that had atrophied from neglect. There was Michael from business school, who had invited him to his wedding 5 years ago, an invitation Marcus declined with a generic excuse. There was Jennifer from his old firm, who used to make him laugh during long days, who he had cut off when he started his own fund because she represented a past he was trying to escape. There was David, who had been his roommate at MIT, who had sent him Christmas cards every year for a decade before finally giving up. These were people who had cared about him, who had tried to maintain connection, who he had systematically pushed away in pursuit of success. He started with his sister, a simple text, "Thank you for this weekend. I needed it more than you know." Her response came immediately. "Anytime. The door is always open. Call me tomorrow?" He promised he would, and meant it. Then he scrolled further, stopped on Michael's name, hesitated for a long moment before typing, "I know it's been years, and I was a terrible friend. I'd like to do better. Coffee sometime?" He hit send before he could change his mind, then put his phone face down on the table, his heart racing like he had just made some massive financial gamble. Over the next few weeks, Marcus began the slow, uncomfortable work of rebuilding connections. Some people did not respond to his outreach, and he could not blame them. Some were politely distant, wary of his sudden interest after years of absence, but some, surprisingly, were willing to give him another chance. Michael agreed to coffee, which turned into a long conversation, where Marcus admitted to being an asshole, and Michael admitted he had written him off as another casualty of Wall Street success. Jennifer